Good morning, John. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Casualty Connect video series focused on the use of new technologies on P&C insurance industry. Our distinguished guest speaker today is John Hall. Hello, John.
Hey, Frank.
You are the founder of Hall Booth Smith, a law firm with offices in Atlanta and across all the country. John, you are known as a national trial counsel, and you lead a team of lawyers at Hall Booth Smith who handle complex cases. You have written and spoken extensively on the issue of disproportionate verdicts, the verdicts you call aberrant verdicts also, or aberrational verdict. And this will be my first question, John. What is for you an aberrational verdict?
Well, Frank, first of all, thank you for letting me be involved. And also thank you for all the work y'all are doing. Your company's really helping on the cutting edge of things. But aberration verdicts, sometimes people call them nuclear verdicts. We don't use that term. A nuclear verdict assumes that's a weapon that can be dropped. It's going to have devastating effect. An aberration verdict is necessarily, it doesn't have to have a devastating effect. If it is recognized in advance, prevented, and then predicted and then countered, it cannot occur. But an aberration verdict is a verdict that is out of proportion to what would be reasonable for a jury to award in a single plaintiff or a limited plaintiff lawsuit involving a catastrophic personal injury. For instance, these days, plaintiffs' lawyers are asking juries if they would give verdicts of $200, $300 million. My last 5 trials, the plaintiffs' lawyers have all asked for over $200 million. And, for a single individual in an injury, somebody that's, heck, even making $100,000 a year, they got comorbidities and others, to ask for that kind of verdict is so out of proportion. And then when juries actually fall for it for a variety of different reasons we'll discuss, and you result in these verdicts, that's what we call an aberrational verdict, one that's usually 10 million plus, and it's out of proportion with what is expected.
Okay. Thank you for this definition. That's helpful. So, how often do they occur in your experience? Because they are always, in the media, but they are relatively rare, right?
Yeah, they're extremely rare. But the fact that there are aberrations and they're so widely put out makes people think they're much more frequent than they are. Actually, we only try, and this is a problem for another day. We ought to be trying 10 to 15% of all med mal cases, but we only try about 3% to 1%, 1 to 3, depending on which statistic you look at of those cases. And aberrational verdicts are usually less than 1% of that 1% to 5, let's say 5% to be fair with everybody on stats. So the 1 to 5% of the cases get tried, and of whatever that percentage is, less than 1% of them are aberrational
Okay.
results. The
So,
problem is because of the psychological warfare,
right.
we then start getting a bleed down effect of aberrational settlements where people go out and settle because they fear or risk averse because they saw this one verdict. It's now affecting settlements, I think, in an even a greater potential than it does a trial.
And that situation may increase the percentage just mechanically.
Well,
Um,
it would increase it as it relates to settlement. It'd still be the same as to cases that actually go to trial, but
right.
for a total outcome, it would increase it.
Yeah. Now, when you speak about such a small likelihood, 1 to 5% is statistically very low, how can they be predicted if they can?
Yeah, and it's less than 1% of 1 to 5% is the aberration verdicts. And I think they can be predicted. First of all, we're a proponent of, and we believe the industry should do extremely early evaluation. You ought to be able to know the exposure you're facing in a case in the first 120 days. The old school comment that, well, we don't have these depositions, or we don't have this expert, or we don't have what the plaintiff's going to say, I just think are outdated. With the expertise that our professionals bring, both claims professionals and attorneys, and the technology assistance that they get these days, I think you could very well go through in almost every case within the first 120 days, set a verdict range and a settlement value that if you continue to do your job 2 years later, when you get ready to do it right before trial, it'll be within 5% of that number. So I think to predict them, we have to first look at them and evaluate them. And some of the factors you need to look at is if the case involves providers or others who failed to honestly review the facts in the case, or report the facts. In other words, changes in records, late charting to the degree that it affects the care and to the degree that it shows an exaggerated view of negligence. So I think you've got to look for those kind of facts, and we can talk more about what are all those facts. But I think you can review it early and recognize that. And then you've got to have a realistic view of damages. Too many people tend to underestimate damages early and overestimate it late. They call it the happy feet syndrome. Right at the start, they have all the bravado. Oh, this case worth $1 million. And then 2.5 years later, as you get in the trial, this case worth $50 million. And I've seen those kind of changes. And I think we owe it to ourselves early to predict the value of cases accurately. So then we would have a better idea. Are we going to be facing what's called an aberration verdict at the end? Because the truth is that if you don't do it early, you don't prepare it in a way to prevent an aberration verdict. I think also one of the things to predict is if you have either aggressive plaintiffs' attorneys who are pushing strategies like reptile or human strategy that are going, and they're being aggressive in discovery and other factors that are going, and the defense is not responding either because they're not familiar with that or they're traumatized by the fact of previous aberration verdicts and they're worried they're going to get hit with a verdict. That's one issue that, we'll talk in a minute about national counsel. We see these bad exposure cases at all times. And that's why we get involved in them. For some folks, this is the biggest case they've ever seen, and certainly the biggest case that they've tried in years. And so that tends to affect. And plus, if they're in a jurisdiction where the plaintiff's lawyer is known or the judge may be, known as a plaintiff's lawyer, they tend to be less active in pushing back, and that can predict an aberration verdict. I think there's also issues that you can see on charting, as I mentioned, charting late, but also just charting on medical records in a way that doesn't really communicate. One of the biggest things that juries that give aberration verdicts believe is that the medical team did not communicate, and in fact had easily opportunities to do it, but didn't communicate. And another factor we're seeing is where you have multiple defendants, and especially now, where not only do you, if the plaintiffs, and the plaintiffs are doing this intentionally, if they sue multiple parties, it used to be that you got that party and their insurer. Now, because of the insurance tower, you've got that party and 4 or 5 insurers. And if you have 4 or 5 parties, you've got a team of 20 people. And if they start infighting and don't cooperate, that'll lead to an aberration verdict. Straight dishonesty by providers or dislikability of providers is something you need to look at. If you've got somebody that cannot help responding to the case without screaming and being angry, that's going to cause an aberrational verdict, which, by the way, we need to undermine that by getting good people to present and prepare these people psychologically right when they get the case, before they're deposed extensively, and before trial. And then finally, and I know I'm going on and on, I apologize.
There are many factors here, yeah.
Yeah, I think the other factors have to look at it jurisdictional, understanding what jury you're in and what the jury pools make up and how you deal with that. So those are some of the factors that I think would predict an aberration verdict that should make you evaluate early and try to resolve it fairly if you can.
Yeah, right. And we are working on the same, John. So you mentioned so many factors, timeliness, consistency of the evaluation, fact-based decision and strategy. Maybe you can wrap up what strategies are plaintiffs using to secure those aberration verdicts.
Yeah, I think the landscape has changed. It used to be the doctor was somebody down the street in a practice of 3 or 4, sort of for those people old enough in the American TV world, the Marcus Welbys of the world, or the friendly physician. And the plaintiff's lawyers know now that that's not true, that most doctors are employed by hospitals. Hospitals are they're not the county hospital, they're multi groups. They've grown into a corporate entity, a corporate enterprise. And many times the plaintiff's lawyers really focus on that corporate enterprise to anger the jury concerning aberration, because every juror's got a story about a bad emergency room visit or a bad hospital stay visit, and plaintiff's lawyers are trying to create this view of an uncaring corporate world. And defendants fall into it when they send a VP of risk to sit at the table for a trial, or they don't personalize the case with by having the provider there and making the provider's story come across. I think also one of the things they're doing is the plaintiffs understand that we've had a change in jurors, and it's not just the Generation Y, Generation X, it's the millennials that get all the blame. It's all jurors, baby boomers, and even those left over from the greatest generation, though there's less of those, because people's whole view of the world has changed in that.
Mhm.
And folks will attribute it to COVID, but it was starting before COVID. Rich Henderson and I, Trans Re, predicted this back in 2015 that we would start to see this process going. And the reason is things have changed. Baseball salaries. Think about it. Hank Aaron, one of the greatest home run hitters of all time, never made more than $250,000.
Right.
And we had the player out in L.A. signed for almost $1 billion, and for that's one player. And plaintiffs lawyers are using those strategies to push, and defense lawyers are being cautious. Defense lawyers became cautious, because they know that cases aren't going to try; they're going to settle anyway. So why should I really go fight with this guy if he's somebody in your community that I'm going to see at the country club on Friday night? And
Mhm.
you've got to push back against these folks, because all these plaintiffs lawyers care about is generational wealth for themselves and not for their clients. And so the plaintiffs push on that issue. I also think that this entire group, the guilt factor from the baby boom generation and the willingness from the millennials and others, has been there is this redistribution of wealth from parents to children. And those children expect that, those young adults expect that they're going to get this generational wealth, or this redistribution of wealth. It's the largest redistribution of wealth in the history of mankind, is going to go. So when they get on a jury, they know from their own personal experience, hey, I'm going to be taken care of. We ought to take care of these people. That hospital's got plenty of money, and
Right.
they don't care. They've got somebody there. So plaintiffs lawyers are looking at that and doing it. And then people have lost the value, a touch of the value of money. So they don't understand what $1 million really do. Plaintiffs lawyers will say $200 million, and nobody points out to them, you take $200 million and you put it at 5% interest. That's $10 million every year forever, never touching the principal of $2 million. And defense lawyers have been reluctant to talk about that. One of the factors of predicting an aberration verdict is a case where a defense lawyer is going to try it without contesting the damages and putting up a reasonable damage opportunity. That most aberration verdicts result when defense lawyers don't do that. Some more of the tactics is weaponizing the 30B6 deposition for trying to find corporate people, upset the C-suite, because if the C-suite has to show up for a deposition or prep for it, they get angry and they start complaining to the claims people, and they complain to the attorneys. And then all of a sudden folks said, well, let's throw another $100 million on this case because I don't want the C-suite upset. Not quite that number, but you get the idea of what I'm talking about that.
Yeah.
And also plaintiffs lawyers have determined strategy. Used to they'd get one or two experts and they go take 4 or 5 of the key depositions and we go try the case. Now the plaintiffs are taking 40 and 50 and 60 depositions because they know that's putting financial pressure on the defendants. They don't want to have to pay their lawyers. And they're saying, let's go make it so uncomfortable that they will want to settle this case and they'll pay us a premium on it. Plaintiffs lawyers, and it happens, and plaintiffs lawyers have recognized it. And then they're getting personal too. The tactics is, I've personally been threatened with, they're going to sue me, take away my family, take away my home because I'm defending these bad people, these hospitals that don't care, these insurance carriers don't care. Then they go do that to the claims person. They go do it to the local defense counsel. They do it to the C-suite folks. In fact, in the book, Reptile Theory and Humanity, they say, go find the highest person you can and go push that person, and he'll push everybody down the list to settle the case. And then with the advent of the version, even though percentages of aberration verdicts are low, the consequence of one is literally a clean out the tower verdict. The whole tower is going to end up being doing it. And so what we've seen now is less risk tolerance within the tower, and they're starting to push down. And plaintiffs lawyers write in their stories through their intranet, go make a demand that's go find out where the top of the tower is and make a demand that's just under the top of the five insurers. Because what that person will do will then push downstream to every insurer, who will then push downstream to every other insurer, tell them, you better settle this case. I don't care what you got to pay for it, as long as it doesn't get to my tower. And
Right.
so that's proved to be a real problem. That's some of the issues, along with the personal attacks and the psychological warfare.
It's impressive because you have mentioned so many factors, and we are far from the rule of law or even the good law of evaluating damages, right? The plaintiff tactics essentially are very far from the damages themselves.
Yeah, well, they have complicit with them a life care planning industry that'll throw up, $100 million for future care. And so if they take all these factors and they can throw that little bit of junk science and coming up with those kind of numbers, they've got enough to get to a jury if you have a judge who will not pay attention and be a real gatekeeper to these things. And so they know what they're doing. And for them, it really is about personal wealth. Every
Right.
plaintiff's lawyer, that's really, it's not about their clients, it's about personal wealth and generational wealth. Most of these cases, every healthcare provider I represent wants to resolve almost any case, and they'll also want to resolve certainly cases where they did something that they're concerned about the care,
Right.
but they want to do it reasonably because they've got to continue to do business and do their things. And the plaintiff's lawyers don't care. They're going to push them beyond that, and that's what's going to ultimately endanger the system that we use.
So you have described a very aggressive reptile strategy and many other tactics on the plaintiff side. What can the defense side do to prevent or at least mitigate those aberrational verdicts?
Well, I think it's really a broad approach. First of all, we need to look at our cases when they come in and evaluate them early, the first 120 days. If it's a case that is strongly, highly defensible, and there's low damage, instead of paying the plaintiff's lawyer $50 to $100,000 to finance the bad case that you can't defend, go try those cases and let the next generation of defense trial lawyer be entertained. However, on those cases that have risks that you can't get to that point, then I think you evaluate the case fully. You look at the standard of care. You understand that plaintiffs are trying through the reptile theory. They say you've got to do everything possible to keep your client safe. That ought to be objected to every time that comes out, every time that question. There'll be a motion filed because that's not the standard of care. The standard of care, you have to do everything reasonable, and the defense has to defend that standard of care and make the point to your doctors and to your experts and to the jury that that means for that conduct to be there had to be no reasonable explanation for it. It had to be unreasonable conduct. And we've got to get that message, first of all, to our witnesses, our defendants, and our experts to prepare them. But then we've got to get it across to the jury and to the judge, who many times is kind of sitting there just hoping the trial gets over without them having to go through appeal because they want to close their docket. We also then have to not only look at standard of care, but we have to look at causation. And causation in a way we haven't done it, especially you take a long-term care case that could be subject to an aberrational verdict. Those people have so many comorbidities, and let's face it, you go to a long-term care facility to pass away eventually, and you know that there's going to be complications. The skin breakdown. The skin's the largest organ in the body. It's going to break down. So when you start looking at those things, you get the jury the knowledge of what are the world of comorbidities for this particular person. In a birth injury case, you got to look at genetics. You got to look and see what other factors, because a lot of times there's that contribution. There's a recent article out from, I think it's the New England Journal of Medicine, that says, you need to look further into genetics because many of these cerebral palsy cases are caused by that and not by last 3 or 5 minutes of anoxia at the end of a 9-month pregnancy. And so I think we have to go through and look at that. I think once you look at it and know that you're going to present damages, you come up with a reasonable value of damage. And then I think you aggressively have to go negotiate. Quit asking the plaintiff's lawyers to send me a demand, because what he's going to do is send me $100 million demand. Instead, evaluate your case, quit being risk averse, and make a substantial offer based on what you see the ultimate value is early. Do it within the first 4 to 6 months. and don't ask the plaintiff for an offer. You go make a demand. That anchors the plaintiff and is a psychological weapon back against them in terms of what the value is. And don't offer $10,000. All you're going to do is irritate the plaintiff themselves, and they're going to start doing whatever the plaintiff's lawyer says. If you make it a substantial offer, which say 50, 60% of what you ultimately would pay, that's a number that the plaintiff themselves will be get engaged and start asking their attorney, why are we running up cost? Why aren't you getting this case settled? Especially in those contingency contracts where the plaintiff's fee jumps from 30 to 50% if it goes to trial. Why aren't we settling it versus you getting another 20% of this case coming back from me?
Makes
And
sense.
so I think by getting early number and putting it out, and then at trial, you have to defend that number. A lot of cases I try, we're probably going to lose on standard of care, and we're going to probably lose on causation. If you're a plaintiff's lawyer, you get these big verdicts. Other plaintiff's lawyers send you easier cases. Your career becomes easier. If you're a defense lawyer and you do well, you get worse and worse cases that give you a less and less chance to win
Right.
outright on those cases. And on some of those cases, characterized as I just did, the goal in those cases is to set what a reasonable damage number is, utilize what standard of care and causation defenses I have to help ameliorate the concern about our conduct, and then put up a reasonable damage while showing the ridiculousness of the plaintiff's life care plan and their $100 million damage. By doing that, I then can get that idea across. And a victory may be having a plaintiff ask for $200 million, us valuing the case at 4 to 8 million, and the verdict coming in between there. That's a victory in those kind of cases. And if you do that, the plaintiffs will be less likely, because it's expensive for them to go try that case and not do that. They're less likely the next time not to take a reasonable sum and to keep this stupid generational wealth following that they're all doing, or not all. I would say most.
Most, yes. So now we are back to facts and data-driven analysis, which is essentially what we do at Optimalex. And let's speak about the future. We all know that on the plaintiff side, they have embraced technology earlier on, they have shared data, and we also know that on the defense side, when I say we, our clients are shy to share and maybe also to adopt those technologies. So, in your view, John, when you think about the future of those verdicts and avoiding them, how is the place and the role of AI and technology in general?
Well, it's in the starting phases. I believe in 5 to 10 years, AI will be as significant of a societal change as electricity was when we became electrified, or the industrial age of the late 1800s, early 2000s, how that changed society. But it's still in the early phases, and we got to be aware of that. I kind of use it with the idea of you get the earliest automobile and you live in a ranch outside of town by 10 miles in the early 1900s. Don't go shoot all your horses, because you're going to go to that 5 miles in that automobile and it's going to break down. Keep a horse until you get there. And so at this stage, I think we all ought to be using an automobile. We all ought to look at technology. And I do think what some of the things I know what you guys are doing that I find that kind of mends technology and facts. I know you do a great data dive and go through and are able to look, but you also cooperate to get those intangible factors and try to factor that into the system. So I think as we get systems that go in and do that, it's never going to replace the let's sit around the table and talk about this case, at least not in our lifetime. It may replace it when the Star Trek time comes and those sorts of things. But I do think it's going to be a great assist in being better and quicker and able to do an evaluation and then manage a case utilizing facts and predictability instead of fear and let's just avoid risk, which is what's causing the current problem. So
Well,
I'm a big proponent of AI, and I'm a big proponent of where technology is going to be a key factor in this world.
right. As the common sense say, you will not be replaced by AI, but you may well be replaced by a colleague who may use better AI than you do.
I'm
right?
going to steal that. I love that.
So, John, thank you very much. You were our guest speaker in Casualty Connect, our video series about the use of technology and AI in property and casualty insurance. Today was mostly focused on medical malpractice claims. I am Frank Giaoui, founder and CEO of Optimalex. Thank you and see you soon.
Thanks, Frank.